There is a case to be made that both sides fighting in Gaza have lost the war, which began on October 7th, 2023. Hamas, which launched a major attack on Israel on that date, has since been substantially physically destroyed and diplomatically abandoned. Its leaders are dead, as are likely thousands of its foot soldiers, and even those Arab countries which once harboured, funded or indulged it have ceased returning its calls. In total, by the estimates of local authorities, at least 60,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli operations in Gaza in the last 22 months. It is unclear exactly how many of those are civilians, but it is certain that civilian casualties run into the many tens of thousands, and almost all of Gaza's pre-war population of 2.1 million are displaced, the consequence of the destruction of 90% of the Gaza Strip's housing stock. In recent weeks especially, hundreds of casualties have been incurred among Palestinians seeking what little humanitarian aid Israel is allowing in. Israel has had some tactical successes, not only against Hamas, but against other long-time antagonists, including Hezbollah, Iran, and the now defunct Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. But these have come at considerable, arguably self-defeating cost, not only of nearly 900 Israeli soldiers killed in action, but of Israel's stature abroad. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant are wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Conditions in Gaza, grim as they were, have grown worse. The UN reports that more than 20,000 children have been treated for symptoms of malnutrition since April. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called it a catastrophe of epic proportions. Even Israel's traditional allies have lost patience. In the last couple of weeks, several countries which had thus far resisted calls to recognize Palestine as a state have either done so or strongly suggested that they might. France, Canada, the United Kingdom, Malta. Slovenia, which recognized Palestine last year, has this week become the first EU country to impose an arms embargo on Israel. All have called for renewed work towards a two-state solution, a sovereign Palestine alongside a secure Israel. Does recognizing Palestine make an end to the war any more or less likely? What is the path to a two-state solution from where we are now? And if Israel doesn't want that, what does it want? This is the Foreign Desk.
And this rise in patient numbers has been directly related to food and aid distribution sites where, especially the ones run by the JHF, are more or less turning into daily massacres.
A Palestinian state is both necessary and possible.
People are looking to see what will these statements and gestures mean, and actually changing something on the ground, either in the short term or the long term.
You're listening to the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. We begin in Gaza. Dr. Mohammed Fadlallah is the Medical Activities Manager of Medicine Sans Frontières Al-Zawaida Field Hospital in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza. This is his eyewitness account of the crisis.
There has been a hunger crisis, malnutrition crisis, starvation crisis here in Gaza, from the top of the strip to the very bottom of the strip. It's a man-made hunger crisis. Food items are not being let in to the Gaza Strip. People are hungry. People are losing weight. People are suffering from the physical, pathological effects of malnutrition. As you can see from the pictures that are being shown by our Palestinian press and things, children are dying of starvation. Here in our surgical hospital, we're seeing the manifestations of malnutrition in other ways. We see it in poor wound healing after bowel repairs and after patients come in with severe wounds and large burns. Their tissue does not heal as it normally should and would if the person's normally nourished. So we're seeing effects on wound healing. We're seeing effects on infections. Patients who are malnourished don't mount normal immunologic responses to pathogens. So many times we're having patients suffer from infections in their wounds that delay healing, infections in their abdomens. If they have a repaired bowel and things like that, we see that those repairs aren't holding up and they're leading to infections and things like that. And the patient's overall ability to recover and rehabilitate. So if they have a leg fracture and they get a fixation done, a large part of that recovery is getting the patients up and mobilized and moving again. And we see that there's great difficulty in having people have energy to be able to get themselves up and moving and recovering and rehabilitating properly. So the malnutrition crisis is touching on all parts of the population, all socioeconomic statuses, all types of patients, young, old, male, female. Nobody is not hungry. Many are malnourished, and the unluckiest are actually starving. And everybody is progressing through the levels. So the people who are hungry will all end up malnourished, and the people who are malnourished will all end up starving and eventually dying if the situation doesn't change. We have seen reports of loosening of some of the extremely punitive and cruel restrictions on aid. There's talk of trucks being let in finally and things of that nature. Unfortunately, without a good and workable distribution system, the aid that's trickling in is going to have there's going to be a lot of challenges with people receiving that aid and having that aid be kind of delivered to every part of the strip that needs it delivered to. It's not enough to let a trickle of some trucks in. From the reports, what has been let through has been far less than what's needed, and at a rate that's far slower than what's needed for the people here to benefit from it and to see a difference. So the border needs to be let wide open. The trucks need to really be brought in at the correct amounts, and there needs to be a UN-led distribution system for the aid for it to finally start making a difference. Another recent thing that we've seen is these airdrops, which are incredibly dangerous, and they also promote chaos when they land and drop, and sometimes we have people coming in with injuries from the chaos that they create, and not to mention the fact that there have been reports of these airdrops landing on people, tents, and things like that in the past. So it's an incredibly dangerous way of distributing aid as well. Our hospital is experiencing record numbers of patients. Almost every couple of days, we're breaking our record number of patients. And this rise in patient numbers has been directly related to food and aid distribution sites where, especially the ones run by the GHF, are more or less turning into daily massacres of people just trying to get what meager food items that they're getting. That has not changed. Just these last couple days, we've encountered many mass casualty incidents of people coming from food aid distribution sites. We've reached critical points in our ability to provide care as an orthopedic hospital and general surgery hospital. A lot of what we do is fix people's fractured limbs and legs and arms. And a few days ago, we completely ran out of external fixators, which is the primary way that we do repair these folks' bones, especially when they're open fractures. And we are collaborating as much as we can with all our partner hospitals to borrow X-fixes from each other, return them, and do the best we can. The latest thing we're facing today is shortages of blood. Many of our patients come in with internal wounds and internal bleeding and routinely will need multiple blood transfusions. And our lab supervisor just today told us that we're down to our last couple of bags of different blood group bags for transfusion. So the situation is incredibly dire from every angle you look at it. And really, action needs to be taken. People are really reaching the end of what they're able to handle and take and tolerate and manage. We've far exceeded the point of cruelty. We've far exceeded the point of cynicism. I think it's time that those with power step up and really change things here.
That was Dr. Mohammed Fadlallah, Medical Activities Manager of Medicine Sans Frontières Al Zawaida Field Hospital in Gaza. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest is Gaeth Al-Omari, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and former Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Gaeth also formerly held various other positions within the Palestinian Authority, including advising Palestinian negotiators. Let's start with a big question. Does a Palestinian state still seem like it is actually possible?
Absolutely. A Palestinian state is both necessary and possible. It's necessary because I just don't see any other way that you can meet the Israeli people's a legitimate right to have a state of their own, but also have the Palestinians have one. And it is possible because if you look at the practicalities, at the land, if you look at the map, there is still space, there is still contiguity. It's challenged, yes, but it's still possible. The biggest challenge right now is political rather than practical.
Do we underplay or underestimate the reality that, by definition, a Palestinian state has to be something that Israel will agree to? And that's not to say that's right or fair. That's just how it is, right?
And first of all, you're absolutely right. Without Israeli agreement, an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, there can be no Palestinian state. If you look at security, though, you have to look at it at two different levels. A Palestinian state basically provide strategic security for Israel by ending this conflict. However, after October 7th, the Israelis, understandably, do not trust anyone with their security. So any Palestinian state will not only have to be demilitarized with enough military capabilities or security capabilities to deal with law and order, but not to threaten Israel. There also has to be international guarantees. In past negotiations, we talked about a role for NATO forces, a role for Arab forces, but ultimately without giving Israel all the security guarantees that it wants, and they are going to be high after October 7th, there'll be no Palestinian state.
And this is where we begin to run into the practical difficulties, because is there, as you see it, an imaginable Palestinian leadership, like an actually plausible Palestinian leadership that could sell to the Palestinian people an idea, at least in the short term, of this sort of semi-state, probably demilitarized, probably with a lot of its external security outsourced to Israel? Doesn't this get us back to where we started before the Second Intifada?
Actually, not really. I mean, in many ways, in all previous negotiations, well, whether it was the late President Yasser Arafat or the current President Mahmoud Abbas in negotiating with Israel, they've accepted the idea of a demilitarized Palestinian state. And it comes from the understanding that having a military for a small, poor state like a future Palestinian state makes no sense. Who is this military going to defend the state against? Israel is much stronger. Jordan is not a threat. So ultimately, a full military is almost a vanity project. And there are many models around the world of demilitarized state who have their security guaranteed by others. And I would throw one last point. In most Arab countries, militaries are good for one thing, and that's mounting coups. And so it's a way of freeing up resources from the military into developing a future Palestinian state. But I think the symbolism of it can easily be sold.
And when you think of where a Palestinian state might be, do you still think in terms of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, capital in East Jerusalem? Does that strike you as non-negotiable?
Absolutely. I think this is the minimum that the Palestinians will ever accept. And it really goes back to, you have to look at the Palestinian narrative and view of history. In the Palestinian narrative, the Palestinians have already made the major compromise back when they accepted the two-state solution. And so what you accept right now, what we call the 67 borders, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, is the minimum. Beyond that, it's not possible to sell it to the public. Now, of course, you can do slight modifications here and there to kind of account for reality, but this has to be the baseline. And by the way, this is not only a Palestinian demand. This is a demand of all of the Arab countries, and it has been consistently so.
Is it clear, though, who, as in which individual or individuals or which Palestinian entity might steer this process from a leadership position? The Palestinian Authority, such as it is in the West Bank, is not really respected or taken seriously by many, many people. So who is that going to be? Who is the leadership that will bring this all about?
You've actually just highlighted probably one of the most complicated political impediments to a two-state solution. I would add to your description of the Palestinian Authority that it's also incapable. It does not have the capabilities. And therefore, if you look at, the public messaging and private conversations with Arab, European, American diplomats, they understand that without significant reform of the Palestinian Authority that deals with issues of political legitimacy, that deals with issues of corruption, capability, governance. Without that, there will be no Palestinian state. There will be no two-state solution. And that's not only, by the way, an Israeli demand. The Middle East is full of failed states. No one wants a new failed state. The Jordanians do not want a failed state on their borders with the West Bank. The Egyptians don't want a failed state on their borders with Gaza. So the issue of reform is key, both for developing domestic legitimacy for Palestinian leaders to engage in diplomacy, but also, frankly, to secure regional buy-in.
But how do you square the difficulty, though, that the Palestinian people will quite reasonably think that it's up to them to choose who their leaders are? But, of course, in reasonably recent history, at least the last time they were invited to choose their leaders, they elected Hamas in Gaza and Fatah/the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. If neither Israel nor any other interlocutors will deal with those entities, do we then not end up in the position of everybody else trying to impose a leadership on the Palestinian people and the Palestinian people saying, well, that's not us, that's not who we want?
Well, I would say there are three kind of angles to what you said. First and foremost, I would say the Palestinians have to have a clear standards of who is allowed to participate in political life and who is not. And this is something that was unresolved in the previous elections. Every society, every country has rules. If you don't follow those rules, then you're not part of the political process. And as a minimum, I think the Palestinians need to impose a rule whereby if you do not respect the singularity of authority, if you maintain militias, etc., then you're not part of the process. I think this is an important point to make for the Palestinians themselves. But secondly, I think we have to look at why Hamas won in the last elections. It won because the Palestinian Authority and its leading party, the Fatah party, were corrupt, were dictatorial, were simply unelectable. And part of the thinking behind doing this kind of reform is to rehabilitate the image of the Palestinian Authority. And finally, I think after the Gaza war, Hamas's standing has certainly plummeted in Gaza. And I suspect the Palestinians, just like the Israelis, will have to go through a major soul-searching exercise once the war is over. And I suspect Hamas is not going to emerge well out of that.
Just finally, then, I think we've demonstrated fairly conclusively in a fairly brisk period that this is all going to be much, much easier said than done. But let's just assume, hypothetically, you were assigned a role in this process tomorrow. Where would you start?
I would start with two things, maybe three things. One, on the Israeli side, I would start with, the principle of do no harm. Yes, we cannot get a Palestinian state tomorrow, but refrain from actions that will make a Palestinian state impossible in the future. That's settlement expansion. That's all of the talk of annexation. That has to stop. If that continues, there will be no two-state solution. Second, of course, you have to start to end the war in Gaza. In an ongoing war, there's no bandwidth, there's no desire, there's no trust, there's no willingness to engage in anything. This has to stop. But then I will have to start with building and reforming the Palestinian Authority. Without having a convincing government that can convince the Israelis that this government, Palestinians, can be a security partner, and that can convince the region that a Palestinian state will be successful, there will be no Palestinian state. So unless you engage in reform and institution building, I fear that any diplomatic process, any negotiations, any international conference will be nice, but ultimately ineffective and will not be translated into reality.
But do those people, that new Palestinian Authority leadership we've been talking about, and this is assuming we can persuade Mahmoud Abbas that his time is up and that the coterie around him, their time is up as well, and they all have to go. Do the people who can step up, take their place and do the things we've been talking about, do they exist?
Oh, they absolutely exist. In terms of raw talent, they definitely exist. I mean, there's a lot of talented people in that society and in that system. The main problem right now is if you're a talented young Palestinian, politically minded, etc., you have no avenues for advancement. You don't have a political avenue because we have no political parties, we have no elections, and you have no governance avenues, meaning you cannot rise through government because it's a corrupt, ineffective government. Open up the space, these people will shine. To give you, anecdotally, I was involved in the efforts of the former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad to do reform in the Palestinian Authority. To me, maybe the most shocking thing is to see people who, I used to deal with as my colleague, as my staff in the PA back in the days, who seemed very mediocre. When given the opportunity, they emerged. So I think the talent exists. The question is, in all of these things, transitional periods are always very vulnerable and very fragile. And this is actually where it kind of falls on the region and on the international community to give support for this transitional period, to ensure that good governance, representative governance, etc., is rewarded. It's a fault to Israel as well. Israel failed to work with Salam Fayyad, and that was one of the reasons why his project of reform failed. So I think it's up to the Palestinians, but without support from the international and regional community and Israel, then the early stages of reform will be too vulnerable to succeed.
That was Gaeth Al-Amari, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio, and I'm joined finally by Julie Norman, Senior Associate Fellow on the Middle East at RUSI. She joins us from Jerusalem. And Yossi Meckelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, who today is in Otzenhausen. And Yossi, I'll come to you first. These countries which have recognised or announced that they're thinking about it, Palestine, in the last few weeks, they're very far from the first. Comfortably more than half the UN already recognised Palestine. But when a country recognises Palestine, especially now, what is it actually recognising?
It's interesting because many times we say it's long overdue. Others would say better late than never. But the reality is there is no state, a Palestinian state as we understand a state with a defined territory and population. But it's more about creating a momentum towards bringing a two-state solution into practice. And in many ways, it's changing the sequence or the order of what we used to think the way towards a two-state solution. Back in Oslo in 1993, the idea was dealing with all the outstanding issue between the Israel and Palestinian, including the issues of borders, settlements, refugees, water, Jerusalem. And then at the end of all of it, Israeli recognition, and more importantly, even international recognition in a Palestinian state, and end of conflict. Now, since this obviously hasn't worked for so long, trying to reverse it and create a momentum and say, let's redress the imbalance in the negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, recognize the Palestinian state, but then start rebuilding everything that we recognize what a state should be.
And Julie, to bring you in, Do we get the impression that something significant is shifting in international opinion in the last few weeks? Because though France and the United Kingdom in particular are quite late to recognise Palestine, they both obviously matter a great deal, both permanent members of the UN Security Council, and possibly nearly, or perhaps even more significant, we have seen the entire Arab League and various other Muslim countries issuing a joint call for Hamas to disarm and give up and leave the Gaza Strip.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, obviously, there's been great international attention to Gaza for almost 2 years now, but that's been largely at the popular level, students, people out in the streets at protests, where many governments have been very hesitant to really take any real kind of concrete actions to change their overall policy on Gaza or on Israel-Palestine more broadly. So this week, right, we've seen obviously the recognition announcements from key states in the Security Council, from the G7 for the first time, really setting up a situation where the U.S. will be the one isolated as the sole permanent member of the Security Council, not recognizing the Palestinian state, and probably likely in the G7 down the line as well. And again, obviously, this is motivated largely from the absolutely devastating conditions and images from Gaza that have been circulating in the last weeks, also on the stall of the last ceasefire talks, but also because of steps that states and state governments are finally starting to take. France and Saudi Arabia hosted a conference at the UN last week with the express purpose of shoring up support for that two-state solution, for that two-state vision, and trying to get that back on track. And alongside that, we had an endorsement of that vision and also calls for Hamas to disarm and to really recognize the Palestinian Authority as the main governing body for Palestinians from all members of the Arab League, something that really is substantial and I think has gotten lost a little bit in the mix because of the European states' announcements.
And Julie, just to follow that up, because you are in Israel at the moment, do you get any sense that Israeli public opinion is shifting on this? Obviously, Israeli public opinion is not a monolith any more than any other country's is a monolith, but attitudes in Israel towards the idea of a Palestinian state had hardened significantly and understandably in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, 2023. Do you get the sense that that is changing, that international disapproval is registering with the Israeli public?
So I would say people here are definitely noticing, these announcements from the international community this week have been heard here. I wouldn't say that's really changed public opinion that much here. Many people in Israel feel that the European states have not been doing enough to support Israel up to this point and whatnot. Obviously there's been protests. There's been a very active left that is, paying attention to these things even more. But I don't see this really changing much Israeli public opinion to support, Palestinian statehood anytime soon. If anything, there will be a bit more entrenchment. I've also been talking a lot with Palestinians also about what they think about this, and I would say everyone is welcoming it, but people are mostly saying, look, we need the killing to stop here. We need things on the ground to change. And so people are looking to see what will these statements and gestures mean and actually changing something on the ground, either in the short term or the long term.
Yossi, a lot of anger from Israel's government, at least, to these recent gestures of recognition from other countries, especially towards the UK's, which is this conditional idea that they will recognise Palestine at the UN General Assembly in September if there is not a ceasefire or something of the sort in Gaza. Now, Israel's claim is that provides Hamas with an incentive to keep fighting and in effect rewards their terror. Is there anything to that argument?
I don't think so. Just imagine that we are on the 6th of October 2023 and these countries recognize Palestinian statehood. What would have been the response from Israel? Probably not very different. And there is, in this Israeli government eyes, there is no good time to recognize a Palestinian state. Whatever point in history we say any country will recognize, they say it's rewarding violence, it's armed resistance. But because this government doesn't believe in a two-state solution, one of the reasons that Benjamin Netanyahu supported transferring money into the hands of the Hamas because he wanted to keep the division between Hamas and Fatah, between Gaza and the West Bank, because the longer this division continue, the longer he can claim against having a viable Palestinian state. So obviously it makes it more difficult, because if you like to spin it that this is a reward Hamas for what he did in October 7, you would expect this government to do so. But we know what the plan for, at least by some of this government, is to occupy at least part of Gaza and rebuilding the settlements. And what we see happening in the West Bank doesn't indicate to any one of us that there is any genuine belief in this government to help and to assist towards building a two-state solution. So, yes, I would expect this government to react like this, but at the end of the day, I think the international community is moving for the first time for a long time in the right direction.
Julie, for all the vapours that the Israeli government has affected at these gestures of recognition by the UK, France and others, is it not the case that there really is only one international player whose opinion they actually care about, which is obviously that of the United States? At which point, is it worth wondering whether President Donald Trump's absolutely abject longing for a Nobel Peace Prize might actually become a factor?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as anyone listening to the Monocle knows, it's whatever Trump might do, we just don't know which direction he's going to move on any given day. And that is on many policies, but including the Middle East. You know, his response and his administration's response so far to these announcements of statehood recognition have been very negative, and they've already taken it out on Canada with the trade deal, on the PA and the PLO with visas and sanctions. And so the initial moves have certainly been very hostile. But again, this is Trump we're talking about. And if he sees that there might be a way to be persuaded, we can say, I would say honestly, that Trump does want this war to end. That has always been kind of his messaging, and I do think is what he kind of wants, but he hasn't been really willing to put in the engagement to make that happen, whether that's in terms of really investing in the process here and pressuring Israel and using the leverage that the U.S. has. As things kind of change in this moment, though, it does put the U.S. in this position of saying, you know, they are going to be the standalone. Are they going to dig into that position? Or is this something that Trump, of all presidents, would maybe be the one to do something different than the U.S. usual way of doing things? I'm not that optimistic. And I would say I think the states making these moves are very clear-eyed about the fact that they don't have the same leverage as the U.S., but the idea is you use the levers you have, whether they're diplomatic or otherwise. It's a time when whatever you have available, you do it, even if it's not going to be the game changers that the U.S. has at their hand.
Yossi, I want to think a bit beyond the two-state solution, but the first angle I want to take on that is, do we yet understand what Benjamin Netanyahu wants if he doesn't want that? I mean, I think it's fair to say he has prosecuted this war a lot further and a lot more ruthlessly than a lot of people imagined he might a little less than 2 years ago. But are we any the wiser as to under what circumstances he would allow it to end and what he hopes might happen next?
I think this goes back to your previous question about the role of the United States. Is there is anyone that he listens, or is the United States? Or if they take the direction of a two-state solution, it stands a chance. I don't think Netanyahu at this stage of his political career has a long-term strategy. He is right now in a completely mode of political survival, handling his corruption trial, looking when is the right time to call election in which to allow him to stay even longer in power and then eventually weaken the democratic system and completely derail his trial. That's where Netanyahu. So the idea that he is a long-term strategy, what we see actually that is easily blackmailed by the right wing. Netanyahu didn't start this war with the idea of occupying Gaza and building settlements there. He didn't start the war with the idea of expelling the entire Gazan population or the so-called humanitarian, put them in humanitarian city. It's sort of a rolling event which he buys in ideas that keeps him in power. And that's, we know, where the one who have clear idea at the extreme right wing within his government, and this makes it even more dangerous. So in many ways, I see the policies, and especially, will be decided as a result of pressure from the outside. And I really believe that the EU has more leverage than they believe they have. And for better and for worse, Trump is one of capable of few turns, and even a few of them at the same time. So if he decides to move in this direction.
If I can just chime in here too, I mean, I think one of the major problems dating from October 7th has been the complete refusal of Netanyahu to articulate any kind of viable plan for Gaza after the war. And as Yossi has said, that's allowed the war to continue. But I would say, being here, traveling around the West Bank, I mean, it's very clear that the policy is to not have a solution. I mean, that's very clear on the ground. The land annexations, the expansion of settlements. I've never seen it like this before as it is right now. And this is coupled with a vote in the Knesset from 2 weeks ago, fully approving of annexation of the West Bank. I mean, that's symbolic in itself, but it shows you where the attitude is in the government, not just with Netanyahu, but really across the Knesset.
And Julie, just to follow that up, and again, bringing it back to Israel where you are now, and also taking in your recent ventures onto the West Bank, do people that you meet still talk about a two-state solution as the only possible way forward? Or do people have other and not necessarily malevolent ideas? Are there people thinking, well, we've talked about a two-state solution for decades and we're no closer to it. Maybe that's not what's going to get us out of this?
Yeah, sure. I'd say both things are true. On the one hand, there's a lot of skepticism around a two-state solution now. People see that as something that the international community keeps kind of trotting out and trying to keep alive in some way, shape, or form, when on the ground it's really hard to see what that would look like. And for years, Palestinians have been talking about other models, whether that's, one binational state with equal rights for all. One idea that's getting a lot of momentum is a sort of confederation model where you'd have a Palestinian and Israeli state, but with some joint aspects to that. But I would say right now, there's a sense of pragmatism also. Palestinians I speak to in the West Bank also know that is where most of the international community is still focused. There's a sense right now that whatever can stop the current bloodshed in Gaza, whatever can stop the current deterioration in the West Bank, most people are willing to give that a go. And so it's not always people's first choice, but if you say, if Israel was willing to go along with this, if this actually happened, would you support it? Most people are willing to go with that now. And I think that's important to recognize.
I think situation, if you take into consideration the last 22 months, you won't expect people to have a completely coherent vision of where it all ends, because all what we see is killing and suffering, and now starvation, and the trauma that Israel has been going through since October 7. And in different ways, those are society in complete disarray for a range of reasons. So what you need is actually leadership. And if a different leadership comes up and with an idea of a two-state solution, and yes, definitely the idea of confederation in a way that restores some hope, restores some belief in each other, stop the demonization and dehumanization of each other, then we can start moving into looking on a different future. But when you are in the midst of something which is so horrific, to expect kind of the people in the street to think, one day we are going to live in a two-state solution in complete harmony is a lot to expect of people. That's why leadership, whether Israeli Palestinians, but also from the international community, is of extreme importance.
Yossi Meckelberg, Senior Consulting Fellow at Chatham House, and Julie Norman, Senior Associate Fellow on the Middle East at RUSI. Thank you both for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.